And switch sides here closer to the microphone.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this seminar today. I'm really pleased to introduce Dr. Kari Veblen. She is an associate professor at Utah State University. She received her PhD at the UC Davis and went on to work for the USGS as a postdoc before transitioning to her position in Utah. She is a central figure in restoration ecology, and one of her great strengths here is her ability to work across the academic and practice divide. So over the course of her career, she's been instrumental in work on understanding the impacts of large herbivores on landscapes. So she's worked with both wild animals in African savannas, as well as livestock in the African savannas and in the US Great Basin. So one of the aspects that we really appreciate about her work in the Hallett Lab is her approach to restoration, thinking about preemptive restoration, so restoring to future conditions. And that's really influenced our thinking on this in the Hallett Lab. So I'll turn it over to you, Kari. Thank you for joining us today and looking forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was a very nice introduction. I appreciate it. So as you have gleaned, I'm at Utah State University. And so we are the land grant for Utah. And so then at USU, I'm in the College of Natural Resources. And so that means that basically everybody in the college does some flavor of applied research that is meant to be useful to people managing resources in Utah and beyond. And so I was hired in 2011 as a rangeland ecologist. And so today I'll be talking to you about restoration in rangelands. And so the first thing that I wanted to do was just talk to you about what I mean when I say rangelands, right? So if you're familiar at all with rangelands, maybe the first thing you think about is these drylands, where you have free roaming livestock, right? So rangelands can also include tundra and forests and really any place that can support free ranging large herbivores, wild or domestic. And so this is going to be distinct from irrigated pasture, for instance. And so this here I put up just to illustrate how widespread rangelands are over the Earth's terrestrial surface. So the gray are areas that at least these authors have classified as being not rangeland. And then the rest of it is what we could consider rangeland. So I myself have had the very good fortune of being able to work in some of the most iconic rangeland landscapes in the world, really. So up there is a picture from my study site in Kenya, where I did my PhD work, and I've continued to do work in a semi-arid savanna. Here is an area of sagebrush in the Great Basin, where I started working as a postdoc and have continued working. And I also started dabbling a bit in the Mojave Desert. And then here's a picture from the Colorado Plateau, just outside of Canyonlands, where I've started doing work since being at USU and have been doing increasingly more work. So I had multi-use rangelands in the title of my talk. And so, of course, there are many uses of these rangelands. People use them for recreation, there are cultural uses. But what I focus on mostly in my work is these lands that are simultaneously used and managed for livestock production and wildlife conservation. And so, of course, deeply intertwined in that is also going to be human livelihoods, especially on the livestock end of things. And so the reason I'm interested in these lands is just globally, we have shrinking land availability. And so people are increasingly going to have to be able to use pieces of land for multiple things. And so especially when you're talking about livestock and wildlife, it can create sometimes complex and difficult problems, but also very interesting things to think about. And so, as everybody is fully aware, drought is a big issue across the Western US. I didn't start off thinking I was going to be doing any sort of climate research or even necessarily drought research. But increasingly, that is what most of my research is sort of coalescing around. And so here on the left-hand side is just a projection for the increase in temperature of the 10 hottest days of the year. And if you're somewhat skeptical of the modeling, here we have actual temperatures. So this was from the Washington Post. And so the actual temperature change from 1895 to 2019. And so you can see here, right, that we are in the hot seat here in the Western US. So against this backdrop of drought and increasing temperatures, we have people who are trying to manage these rangelands sustainably. So on the left-hand side here, I have this little cartoon that's meant to depict a nice, healthy, functioning rangeland. It's got these nice, robust plants. It's providing forage and habitat for these wildlife. We have cattle grazing in here as well. And so you have a whole host of ecosystem services that are associated with these functioning rangelands. And then so you have that here in this little well, and then there's the potential for crossing over a threshold into an alternative state. And so I've depicted this sort of parched earth scenario here where we have these plants that are not in very good condition. And so, when you have an area, a rangeland area that's degraded, there's potential for loss of life, right, of animals, of plants as well. And so there's a picture there where you've lost plants, you're going to lose soil with that as well. And then here's a picture of Salt Lake City, and that's a haboob that went through a few years ago. So there's these big dust wind events, right? And so a very urban area, but being impacted by, potentially impacted by management on these rangelands in the general region. And so what I'm going to do today is talk to you about this process of trying to nudge the system, or sometimes push very hard to try to get it from this degraded state back to some sort of functioning condition, or at least trying to restore some functions. I do work a lot on this side as well, but I won't be talking about that. It'll just be this restoration that I'm focusing on today. And so I work in a few different areas, but today I'll be talking about the Great Basin, right? So the Great Basin is here bounded on the west by the Sierra Nevada and the Coast Range, and on the east by the Rocky Mountains. And so it's over 500,000 square kilometers. And what is striking about this here is all this yellow in here, which is Bureau of Land Management land. And so those are public lands, so federally managed lands. And so you can see that really makes up the majority of the land in the Great Basin. And so if you've thought much about BLM or heard much about the BLM, probably you associate cattle grazing, right? So private ranchers are able to lease land in the Great Basin, largely these sagebrush lands, and graze their cattle there. So of course, there's interest in maintaining forage for these cattle. But at the same time, these lands have to be managed for multiple uses. So the Federal Land Policy Management Act of 1976 mandates that these lands are managed for sustained yield and multiple use. And so one of those key uses, aside from providing food for cows, is maintaining wildlife habitat. And so here we have the poster child for sagebrush, which is the sage grouse. So it's been this umbrella species for conservation and restoration of these sagebrush-dominated rangelands throughout the Great Basin. And so, so nicely as this umbrella species, that means these forbs that their chicks depend on are something that people worry about, in addition to grasses for nesting cover. And so, again, if you have thought much about what happens in the Great Basin, you have probably heard of cheatgrass, Bromus tinctorum, which has been introduced from Eurasia a number of times, actually. And so it is part of this cheatgrass fire cycle that you may have heard about. And so the idea is that you have, a sagebrush landscape like this that's at least partially invaded by cheatgrass due to disturbance of some sort. And then it's flammable, so you get wildfire. And this wildfire is at intervals that are not well tolerated by the native vegetation, so shorter fire return intervals. And so then that in turn leads to more invasives and then more fire. And so you have this cycle that eventually typically ends up in a monoculture of cheatgrass, which is not going to offer any of the ecosystem services that people are really interested in. And then often even worse with cascading effects into secondary weed invasion. And so what we do know about the ecology of this system is that having perennial vegetation is good for trying to prevent these monocultures from forming, from trying to keep cheatgrass from invading, right? So these plants take up space because they're perennials, both above ground and below ground, right? And compete against cheatgrass. They stabilize the soil. And so anybody who's trying to both increase the resistance of these areas to cheatgrass invasion and then resilience to fire, which eventually will happen, knows that you want to maintain your perennial plant populations or restore them in some cases. And so the restoration work that happens almost always happens at this point in this cycle. So after fires burn. And so this is a fairly typical scene here, right? It looks like a Martian landscape. There's not a plant to be seen. And you take in large equipment, big agricultural equipment, and get seed on the ground or in the ground and then pray for rain, right? And so this happens after fire, and it is by policy needs to happen within a year after the fire. So the emergency stabilization and rehabilitation policy stipulates that within a year. So that means if it burns in July or August, there's a great rush to get seed onto the ground that fall before winter comes and you're no longer able to access the site. And so at this point, I invite you to sit back and think like an ecologist, or maybe try to read my mind, right, about, what is wrong with this picture. So pretend like you're not a land manager and pretend like you have no practical concerns in the world, like an ecologist like me, and think, what do you think might be wrong with this picture? If you're a restoration ecologist, have any ideas? Anything come to mind? Yeah. Yep, that's a great, yes. So that is a great point, and that's quite related to what I'm talking about. So there's a lot of disturbance associated with this. And so you're right. So it's not uncommon to go in and see an area that's been drill seeded, and you see no native or no seeded plants, you just see rows of cheatgrass, right? So the disturbance has just created more invasion. So the thing that I was trying to get you to read my mind about is that this is very reactive restoration, right? You wait until it burns and then you go in and try to restore. And it's rational, right? I mean, if you have a fire like this, you need to restore so that you don't lose your soil and so that you can actually try to get some plants in there. But there's been very, very little research or management attention paid to trying to restore before you get to this Martian landscape. So so basically sites where it's like, maybe it's not in an optimal condition, but it's still functioning, and you probably have a prayer of getting some plants actually established in the system. So because of this, some collaborators and I have been promoting this idea and doing research on this idea of preemptive restoration, or what we are also call proactive restoration. And so that means going into an area that might look a little bit like this. You still have your sagebrush there in your sagebrush overstory, and then here in the foreground, you can't tell too well, but it's a depauperate understory. So you've lost some of your native species, some of your perennial grasses, and you have a little bit of cheatgrass, maybe even a moderate amount. And so if it burns, you will be in trouble, but it's okay. It is still offering, it's still functioning in many ways that are useful and is desirable in this particular state. And so what we've been promoting is the idea of going into the system and trying to figure out how to restore in there. So this probably seems fairly straightforward. So what I just want to emphasize is that this is not how restoration happens across the Great Basin. It is, I mean, when restoration happens, it is basically always after a fire and reactive. And so if we're going to say, okay, there's been lots of research and including things that I've done looking at how do you restore in these types of landscapes. But if you're thinking about it as an existing sagebrush stand, the ecological question is, so how, where should you restore? How do you optimize restoration? So this is a bird's eye view, and you've got this mosaic of sagebrush canopies, and then these interspace areas between the plants. And probably 10 years ago, my very first master's student, Micah Holtheisen, I sent her out to the Great Basin. I still did not have a great concept of how much work was good for a master's student, and had her go to 40 sites across the Great Basin cold with no information about whether they were necessarily going to be good sites or not, and collect data on the cover of the most common perennial grasses in relation to sagebrush locations. And so what I have here on the x-axis is we have a precipitation, we have a low to high precipitation, and then these two different species. We have cover, which is here on the y-axis in the canopy, and then in the interspace. And at the time, what I thought was somewhat miraculous, it actually fits with what you might expect from the stress gradient hypothesis, right? So you have a more stressful condition here at lower precipitation. And so when the precipitation is lower, you have higher cover in the canopy than the interspace, and so you're expecting that you have facilitative or more net positive interactions, in the more stressful situation here at low precipitation for this species. And then the same thing here. The patterns are a bit different, but you have higher cover in the canopy than the interspace. And so this was all just observational data from plants that were growing out on the landscape. And so, the plants at this point have gone through multiple biotic and abiotic filters, right? Multiple life stages. And in this case, we're not controlling for grazing. So that could have been grazing, could have been confounded with this precipitation gradient. And so in this next phase of this project, we're actually have been looking at trying to actively restore. So a controlled experiment, planting into these canopy and interspace areas. And so the idea of targeting canopies of plants as restoration microsites is something that people do in drylands all over the place. Like, if that's an opportunity, then you take it. And so, the reason for that is, these canopies of plants oftentimes can provide physical protection, like for instance, from herbivores, like for thorny plants, or even here, even sagebrush, where it's hard to get for animals to get their noses underneath there, and then also create favorable abiotic conditions. So there's less solar radiation, higher nutrients. In the case of sagebrush, there's hydraulic lift, where it actually increases moisture availability to plants. And specific to this particular system, though, growing right under the canopy is not ideal. Well, it may be ideal for the plant, but for a restoration person, it's not ideal, because there are data showing that you get experience fatal heat loads underneath there when the site burns, and it will burn. So planting closer to the canopy drip line makes more sense if you don't want your plants to burn up. And then if you look out here in the interspace, what I'm calling the sort of maximum interspace, as far as you can get from all of the neighboring plants, the idea is you'd have reduced competition from that nurse plant. And the potential downside, though, is that these gaps between plants and sagebrush systems are where you get a lot of cheatgrass invasion. So that may not necessarily be favorable. And so, our hypothesis is that maybe it's somewhere kind of in between there where there's an optimal area or optimal zone for trying to plant out these plants. And so we'd hypothesize that survival be maximized in this intermediate zone somewhere where plants could reap the abiotic benefits associated with the sagebrush, but then at the same time experience less competition. And so we planted out a bunch of plants. And then part of that is that we predicted that the maximum survival for these plants, for these herbaceous species, would be closer to the canopy here during a drier year and for younger plants. So basically having sort of this net positive effect of growing near the canopy of a plant when you need it the most. And so for this portion of the project, we planted out across 6 sites that were in 5 major land resource areas across the Great Basin. This is Sophia Koutsoukis, who did a lot of this work and just defended her PhD. And so we focused on 4 species. We have blue bunch wheatgrass here, which is a deep-rooted native perennial grass. These are actually all native species. We have the bottlebrush squirreltail, which is more of a medium-rooted grass. This common yarrow, which, as you can see, has this fibrous root system, and then this Monroe's globe mallow, which has a tap root. Oh, and so yeah, so we had these 4 species, and then we had 100 plants of each of those species, and then we had those. Then that was times 6 of these sites, and then we initiated this in each of 2 years. So a total over the 2 years, a total of planting out about 4,800 plants, and then so we planted them at a range of distances from the canopy of the sagebrush. And we followed them over time. So here we have a globe mallow when it was first planted up through what they look like at year 2. And so the first thing on this very large graph that I want to point out is that we had, for the 2 different planting years, we had different precipitation. So in that 2018 cohort, we had 130 to 160% of the normal precipitation. In 2019, it was 75 to 120. And so for this 2019 cohort, we had very low survival. We had no significant distance effects. Those 2 were probably related to each other. So I'm going to take them off the screen, and we will just talk here about that 2018 cohort. So for reading this graph here, we have the survival on the y-axis, and then we have the 4 different species here. So these are the 2 forb species, and then the 2 grass species there on the right. And then we have their survival for year 1, which is the top row, and then their survival to year 2 for the second row, and that's relative to the first year, right, as opposed to from the beginning of the experiment. And then on the bottom, we have scaled distance from sagebrush, which is just the distance that the plant was from the sagebrush divided by the radius of that focal sagebrush, just to account for the fact that larger sagebrush have a larger zone of influence. But you can just think of it as distance. And that gray line right there is the edge of the canopy. And so what hopefully you see as somewhat obvious here is that for the 2 forb species, you can actually see higher survival during that first year in that intermediate zone, right? So not right at the canopy, not in that maximum interspace area, but somewhere in between. And so they peak there at different places. We think that maybe it's because globe mallow has the taproot, and so with the hydraulic lift, it only really provides moisture below about 10 centimeters, and so maybe it can access the moisture closer to the sagebrush canopy. And then for these 2 grasses, they're both pretty competitive species, especially this Elymus, which is just a genus alone, but this species as well is kind of a hanger-on, right? In these these landscapes when a lot of the other grasses have dropped out. And so just generally thinking they may be hardier species. And then the other thing is that these areas were not grazed, so they also could have been this also could be part of why they occur in those interspace areas. And then the other part of it with these, or the other thing that is fairly striking to me is if you look down there at year 2, you see, so there aren't any significant distance effects, but you see that the actual survival is pretty high. So, suggesting that year number 1 really is that big bottleneck. But then if you can make it to year 2, things aren't too bad for you in that second year. So another thing we did as part of this study is that we measured we measured ground cover, right? So we did some visual estimates of cover and quadrats associated with the planting microsites. And so these were all the different categories of cover that we assessed. And so the one that I wanted to draw your attention to was this biological soil crust cover, which also shows a peak here in this intermediate zone. And for people who aren't super familiar with biocrust, regrettably, this is not my picture, and so this is not my seedling, but it's a really nice picture that I often use, that I found on the internet, that just shows you what happens to the microtopography of the soil when you have crust. So these biological soil crusts are cyanobacteria and algae and lichens, and so they create this this bumpy surface, and they can increase the nutrient availability, and then also even provide safe sites. And so what we found was that the cover of biocrust co-varies a bit with respect to distance from the sagebrush. So, okay, so what does all this mean for restoration? Thinking in the, more globally about it, as I mentioned before, people do think a lot about the use of nurse canopies, especially in these really dry environments. And they think of it as just this binary between the canopy and the inner space. And so, we would suggest that maybe a finer look at that interspace zone and how plants respond and establish in those different microsites could be advantageous in these systems where you're just looking for any tiny little bit of help you can get to get plants established. In the Great Basin specifically, this idea of targeting the intermediate zone could effectively be an opportunity to close gaps between plants. So it's in those gaps between perennial plants that you get invasion of cheatgrass. And so if you can plant a little bit farther from the canopy rather than just like right at the drip line, then you may be better at closing gaps and creating basically more underground space that's occupied by roots of these perennial plants. And then just based on those results, there's the potential for biocrust to be an indicator of suitable microsites. So if you're a manager going out and saying, okay, where should I go in and plant this? That maybe if you see an area with biocrust, and like whether it's cause and effect or simply that they're looking for the same habitat, we don't know, but you could potentially target those. The caveat to that is that you don't want to go destroy all your biocrusts, but there's some more recent data, and then also just sort of some anecdotal observations from our site that the crust does not take as long to recover as we previously thought. We thought it was like basically never recovered, but it seems to be faster. So this is not our silver bullet to restoration, but in terms of thinking about whether preemptive restoration might be feasible and where you might do it, it seems like it could work, right? And like we have some kind of information, and these are the types of questions we might ask in order to actually make it work, ecologically speaking. However, the adoption of any sort of alternative restoration approach is not just an ecological choice. And so that's where the social scientists, Mark and Carmen, come in on this project. And so here we have this land manager, this restoration decision maker, and you see all these factors that go into them deciding what to do and whether they might do something new or different than what has been done in the past. So Carmen and Mark interviewed, I think it was 12 different land managers, and then analyzed their data with this causal layered analysis that gets at these different layers of in people's belief systems. And so, at the very top there's just these pragmatic concerns of cost and labor, right? There's a reason people have been doing things the way they have. It's probably the most cost-effective way. And so to do anything different is probably going to be more expensive or harder. And then if you go a little deeper, there are these laws and regulations, so just basically agency policies and just and what people are told that they need to do or what they default to. If you go a little deeper, there's this idea of faith and science and needing evidence, which is very rational. Of course, I'm not going to try something new if I can't go somewhere and see that it's actually worked. And then at the base here, which I think is probably the most interesting result, is this idea or the belief that human intervention is most appropriate when the ecosystem services have already been interrupted by human activity. So that means if you put up a picture of an area that Martian landscape, very clearly that needs restoration. But if you have one that's in kind of that intermediate state where it's like it could use a little bit of restoration, but it doesn't look that bad, that doesn't look so altered, that people think that necessarily needs to be actively restored. And as part of this work, they also surveyed practitioners about a whole bunch of different alternative restoration approaches. So there's using locally adapted seed, actually planting sagebrush plugs, doing seed coatings. Those are other alternatives. And then what we were focusing on, which is this idea of preemptive planting. And so what was very surprising to us with this particular result is that if you look here, and we asked them to indicate whether they thought adopting this would be very easy, somewhat easy, or very difficult, that a lot more people said that they thought it would be easy than we ever would have imagined, right? And even relative to these other approaches. But if you dissect it down and look at non-federal versus federal practitioners, it becomes clear. So here we're talking about conservancies, private land, maybe areas where you're dealing with smaller tracts of land and fewer policies that you need to abide by. And here we have the federal people. So these people managing the Bureau of Land Management. And so what you see here, right, is that this idea of a practice being very easy. It's like many fewer people felt that way here when you actually looked at the federal respondents. So the good news about this is that at least there are some people who are able to consider this and think that it may be either very easy or somewhat easy to do, which is good if you're hoping that people will adopt this. And we can't claim credit for this at all, but there has been increasing interest by people in the Great Basin, not necessarily specifically in this idea of preemptive restoration as we're framing it, but a very related idea of defending the core. So focusing on these areas that aren't the burned ones, but on ones that are in good condition, and then trying to increase the resilience of those areas. Okay, so I put this up before and I asked you to think like an ecologist and tell me what you thought was wrong with this picture. And I had you try to read my mind and I said, okay, the fact that it's reactive is a problem. So there's another problem that I see with this, right? As a person trying to get plants to grow in this situation. Any ideas about what that might be? Yes. Yes, that's true, and that factors into it. Yeah. that you're assuming that what you, oh, right, that if you plant things that they'll grow there. Yes. So those are all good. And they're somewhat related to this idea that this is being done via seeding. Okay, so they're trying to put seed in the ground, and you know, in areas that are incredibly water limited, getting things to grow from seed is very difficult, right? So if you think about, you know, if you are a gardener, right? If you could put a garden start out there, that's pretty nice, right? Because you have gotten past this bottleneck of trying to get this very delicate seed to germinate and grow. So there's a good reason that people do this. I mean, these are giant land areas, and as I said before, they have to do this within a year. It's an efficient way to get your restoration going. But we also know that it doesn't really work very well. A reviewer didn't like it when we said that it often or usually fails, but it does often fail. And so this is a study, not by me, from a few years ago, where they looked at after fires at areas that had been seeded. And it turns out that for native species, you did not have any more cover in areas that had been seeded than in areas that had not been seeded. Okay, and so, I mean, there were some intricacies in there, but that's really kind of the bottom line. You know, and we know, I mean, it makes sense, right? So here we have, you know, a seed that's germinating, and then it's working on emerging and popping out of the soil. And this is being done in these conditions that are hot and difficult for seeds. And so at least at one site, we have some data. This was out near Burns, where they looked at the probability, the transition probabilities among these different stages. And if you look here from germinated seed to emerged seedling, right, it's just this 12%. So that's quite low. And they have kind of different definitions of what these different stages are, but I can tell you that from data that I have and the data other people have, and any manager who's worked out there, also just getting the plant to be a year old is a giant bottleneck. So the solution that we propose, and that I kind of glossed over when I was discussing that first part of the project, is this idea of high input restoration. And so when I say high input, I mean you grow these seedlings in the greenhouse. So you have to plan this, you have the space, you have the water, and then when you actually plant them, you need to get them out of the tubes or out of the cases there, try not to disturb their roots too much, and then you need to get them in the ground. So this is, you know, just using a sharpshooter. And then this is 2 full-size humans. Sophia's taller than I am, using this power auger to get a seedling in the ground. So this is a lot of input. This is hard, right? It seems completely nuts to do this. Some work that I did a while ago is we compared trying to get plants established from seed versus seedling. It seems fairly obvious that this should work better, but we actually quantified this. And so we did 3 of those same species that I have been focusing on here: the blue bunch, the squirrel tail, and the globe mallow. And so we just did, you know, the canopies and the inner spaces here for each of those. But what I really want you to just look at is that y-axis and look at the survival. So this was at 19 months that we did it, and so it really probably averages out there around like 5 or 6% survival, which is actually not awful for seeds, but you know, it's not amazing either. And then for the seedlings, again, we have those three same species, and then we have an interloper here. And it's kind of a long story as to why we have it. And again, I just want you to look there at the y-axis. So the far right bars on both here are after 20 months, so about the same time period. And you can see that, I mean, for blue bunch, it's amazing. It's like 75% survival at that point. And then even for, you know, like squirrel tail, we're talking about over 20%, which is a lot. And so trying to plant out with these seedlings is something I've been doing in a number of different contexts. So one of the studies has been in salt desert. So these are going to be lower elevation areas in the Great Basin. And so they're these salt affected soils, lower precipitation, lower productivity and recruitment, and they're often thought of as throwaway areas because they're just so hard to restore. And if you are doing restoration, it's not going to be with native species, it's with introduced Eurasian grasses that are hardier and you're better able to establish them. And so with this particular study, we just, we're looking at the difference between planting in the spring versus the fall. And all that I really want you to focus on here is that, so for this fall planted cohort, again, looking at the survival, I mean, we are talking about, 67% survival here for Elemis, which is just, I mean, it's just unheard of. It's amazing that that actually happened. And it was a wet year, but just seeing those numbers compared to like often what is like 0% when you're dealing with seedings. And then even there, if you look at the spring planted cohort, that's still not bad, right? We're still talking about like around 20%, which is pretty good. And as just a little bit of an aside, during that spring planting, when they were, when we had the lower survival, it looked like planting into areas that had higher development of those biocrusts actually were associated with higher survival. So again, going back to the idea of maybe biocrust as being an indicator. So with this idea of high input restoration, what it really rests upon is this idea of achieving a lower cost per restored plant. So an example here might be, there are data out there saying that, if you want to get a sagebrush established in from these seedings, you have to plant every year for like 3 to 5 years, and then you'll get one. That's expensive. That's a lot of work. And so is that really going to cost less than putting a bunch of energy into growing the plant and putting it in, and if it has a better chance of survival? And so people are actually doing this a bit with sagebrush, less so though with herbaceous species that I've been working on. And this idea of tracking costs, like it's surprisingly, people don't do it very much in the restoration literature. And part of it is because it's hard. I mean, market prices change every single year, whether you're talking about seeds or equipment rent, equipment use or anything. So it is hard. But we were able to do it for one of our project sites in Idaho. And so on the left there are sagebrush seedlings that are being put in as tubelings. And then here we're calling wildlings for any Game of Thrones fans. And so what that is, this is actually the high input. We're digging up mature plants with a huge root ball and transplanting those. And we're able to, in this context, we're able to do it because it was a salvage from a site nearby. And so this is a 1-year survival. Huge difference, right? So the mean chance of survival for wildlings was way higher than for tubelings. And I have the 3-year data, just not for anything yet. And it's very similar, like these changes persisted beyond that first year. So by tracking costs, we're able to look at like labor costs and travel costs and everything. We're able to look at the cost per established plant. And so in the end, it turns out for those wildlings, that higher input approach, it is less than half the cost per established plant, simply because they survive better. Okay, so I'm just going to sum up here. So we know intuitively and from data that drought is very problematic for restoration. It's already problematic without drought, but it's problematic when you impose that drought on it. And what I propose is that some of these difficulties could be mitigated by shifting how we're thinking about restoration, again, with only semi-practical concerns factored in. By doing preemptive restoration, so restoring in these areas when they look like this instead of when they look like that Martian landscape, and then also these high input approaches that may pay off in the end. And of course, to do this, we need to build this technical capacity. So that means actually having research looking into how to do this and how to make it work. And then of course, develop that hand in hand with this sort of institutional and social capacity to make it realistic and something that people are able and willing to actually use. So with that, I will just thank you all, thank my collaborators and funders, and then also thank my partner, Dan, who is home watching these guys so that I could be here today. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions. Yes.
First, thank you so much for coming so I'm wondering how long it takes for a biocrust to form and to what happens to biomass when you are, or like what the biomass looks like, or even there in areas where they would be removed the post-burn restoration.
Mhm.
So yeah, I'm just curious.
Okay, yeah, so the questions are about the biocrust. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if I've actually seen research substantiating this, but in my head, it's very clear that biocrusts are these kind of placeholders, right? So it's like you can have perennial grasses that are just sort of keeping cheatgrass out. Then you have biocrusts as well. And so the main thing they do is they stabilize the soil. And so yeah, so if you have biocrusts that are there, they're surviving, after a fire, bringing in machinery can definitely break them up. And we, the sort of research community, used to think, it was like 50 or 100 years for biocrust to really, kind of come back. And there's been more recent research showing that it can be actually shorter, right? Like, and there's a successional process associated with it. So, they may not be as developed, but, it can happen on the order of a few years. Really, like, I would be in very big trouble if I were just going around saying, go find biocrust and plant into those areas. But the fact is, they probably have similar sort of habitat requirements to things that you're trying to get established out there. See, yeah, the next.
Question is, you were doing this where there was no rate. What happens to the perennial grasses when you do the habitat?
Right. Okay. So the question is, so we did this in areas where there was no grazing, and what happens when you put the cattle back? So I wouldn't say there was no grazing. There are a couple of the areas where there had been no grazing because there'd been fences up. There are a couple of areas that actually got hit heavily by horses. And so, I mean, the key thing is you need to establish the plants when there is no grazing, right? And so in these situations, like there's kind of this magic rule that you wait 3 growing seasons after, like, so you seed, and then after 3 growing seasons, then it's ready to be grazed. And that, I mean, and that can happen in some situations. It may take longer. In other situations, it may not happen. And so, and that's another thing that I've actually, another project is looking at how long after grazing before you can go in and defoliate a plant, either manually as we did or with a cow, and not have and basically see, is it going to continue to grow and reproduce and produce tillers. So there's a very long way of saying that protecting them and establishing them in the first few years is very important, and then after that, having proper grazing management or appropriate grazing management. So that means building in rest and rotation, and not letting them get grazed too much. Yep.
The comment briefly was that we went through a similar sort of evolution using plugs in the western wetlands, where we started using seeds, and then discovered the plugs survived better.
Mm-hmm. Which is funny because it's like, well, of course they do, right? Yeah. Yep.
A little harder and safer.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, we've talked about, using robots. I mean, people are talking, in various contexts, using robots for restoration. I mean, or like going with an ATV and just plugging things in. So yeah, there are some more technical than what I described as technical barriers or considerations. Let's see. I think, Cal, you had the next question, and then.
So all very fascinating work. Thank you so much for sharing. The idea of biocrust is really intriguing to me, like the soil dynamic. So you're talking about the wilding, like how much of that do you think is the plant being developed in response to stress, like it being better suited to being transplanted, versus like it hosting microbial like the soil you actually have?
Yeah. I mean, that's a good question. So the question is like, so what is it about transplanting those wildlings with that big root ball that is advantageous, right? And so like, maybe it's simply that soil, maybe it's keeping the roots intact, maybe it's the fact that it's bigger, or maybe it's being kind of insulated, right, by having the soil microbial community, or maybe the crust community on top. So yeah, I don't know, but it seems very likely. And then the question is, and so then what happens as we go further out? There's some evidence from looking at seeds versus seedlings that, and so this may be the case for seedlings versus wildlings, that, you have higher survival of the seedlings than the seed, but then at a certain point, and this is with sagebrush, but then at a certain point, the ones that establish from seed actually end up doing better, like after a few years. So looking at it over the long term certainly makes sense. And then also looking more into the soils and the soil communities. If I can get more funding, I'll do that. Yes.
Is there consideration of climate adaptation with restoration? Like, is there are you choosing species that are more susceptible to the plant in or previous, are you choosing species that are more fire tolerant?
That's a good question. And the answer is really all over the board. I mean, people are definitely thinking about it. They're thinking about it from, doing this, like, the bioclimatic envelope modeling and saying, okay, what can be here now, but what can be here later, right? And say, like, maybe we should be planting those species. And there's even talk about, like thinking about different subspecies, right? And moving those. So yes, I mean, people are certainly thinking about that as well, but then, yeah, I mean, it's like deciding to buy real estate in the Central Valley, thinking it's going to be, be an ocean front later, right? I mean, it's there's some risk to that, and people, yeah, I think they're trying to really balance that and think about it. Yeah. Yep. Oh, okay.
I could read them, but.
Okay.
It's on the chat.
Okay. Okay, what if you plant seedlings in a dry year? Do you think planting seedlings is more drought tolerant than seedlings? I mean, probably, but I will say that if there's one theme to all of this work, including with the plantings, is that plants need water. So, and so yes, even with so they are more robust, but you still suffer without it. Are you guys okay on time? Are we okay on time? Okay. In the study on optimal planting distances, you mentioned at the beginning that one constraint on planting close to shrubs is fatal heat loads and fire. Was that part of that work too? Maybe not applying experimental fire to your plantings, but could you overlay what is known from other studies on plant mortality and wildfire with distance from shrubs, which could shift that peak of optimal survival a bit further away? Yeah, I mean, there's certainly that potential. So April Hewlett and those guys out at the Great Basin Ecology, what's it? Out in Burns, those guys. So they're the ones who actually did experimental burns at different different distances from the sagebrush. So yeah, there is actual empirical data on that. And so being on the drip line of the canopy is not ideal, but it's a lot better than being underneath. And then other one, so in terms of sagebrush, are there functional ecosystem differences later on between an even age stand, like from a successful drill seeding, versus more complex age structure from wildlings? And so, yes, it's kind of one of those things that surprisingly not too many people have. A lot of that is just because you're just trying to get anything to grow. But yes, there are definitely functional differences. I mean, a lot of it will depend on how they're recruiting, but a thing that people worry about with managing these sagebrush rangelands, in some cases, not so much where cheatgrass is an issue, but like in some places in Utah, is that if you get too many of like big sagebrush, then you're not getting younger sagebrush recruiting, and it may not, and then the perennial grasses also start dropping out. So yeah, so having the more diverse age structure is good, but getting anything to grow is good too. Yep, Lauren.
I have a question on the social science results.
Uh-huh.
So it's really interesting, and it's like in hindsight really obvious that the federal people will feel more constrained. But does that mean that for kind of targeting where you first try to do any of these tools at like a landscape scale, you are targeting non-federal partners to do that proof of concept that would then provide the science background for the federal, or is it just too difficult because it's all BLM land to even?
So that's a great question. Yeah. So for Zoom, yeah, the question is like, so if it's hard to do these things on federal land, then should you be doing, these demonstrations on other land? And I mean, I'd say it's good to do both, but so that last one that I showed you with the wildlings, like the big sagebrush transplants, that was on private land. So it was Monsanto, which is now Bayer, and they had to do some mitigation. They wanted us to create sagebrush habitat, and we thought they were insane when they said they wanted to plant like to take these big transplants of sagebrush. We're just like, nobody would ever do that. That's completely crazy. But we said, okay, well, let's just try it, because they were going to mow it under anyways for a mine. So we tried it. And so, I mean, so it's this really surprising result where we could do essentially whatever we wanted, right? And I will be talking about that at the SRM meeting, to a bunch of federal and state managers. And we actually, and somebody from the state, the Division of Wildlife, asked me about that result and and sort of started experimenting with that. So yes, so it is a good resource to be able to do it on private land of some sort, or with the state or something like that, because yeah, it is very restricted, and they all talk, they work together. So yeah, it's rational, because it is very hard to get things done oftentimes on public land. So yes.
When we do this reactive feeding, where does that seed come from? Is it primarily perennial native, being grown by some contractor?
Yeah, I mean, so they need a lot of it. So the short answer is it comes from the BLM seed warehouse, right? So yeah, so they have collectors who go out and collect seed for the, and like you'll have the locally identified seed, but then there also is seed that is grown on farms, right? So I work with the USDA ARS Forage and Range Research Lab, and so they are a bunch of plant breeders, and so there are these varieties of some of these species that they have, like, they know the whole genome and they've been working on it for years, and then growers grow it, and so you can get it in really large volumes. So it's kind of everywhere you can.
Is that actually that cost analysis as far as like putting plugs in, right? That's presumably going to be replacing seeds, or someone's going to have to grow that. Right?
Oh, someone's going to have to grow that. Yeah. Yep. It's true. So yeah, we're right. Yeah, for the, no, I did not factor that into any of the cost, but yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, but I think, the idea is, if you're putting it out into the ground, the seeding rate that you need to do versus, if you're putting it into a little cone, it's like you can put 3 in there and you're gonna feel pretty good that something's coming up, right? As opposed to having to putting like, a large volume. Yes. So thus far, with the controlled experiments we've been doing, we've been aiming for areas that are not very cheatgrass invaded. And so that's a whole other layer of it, right? Is what you do, whether you go in and like herbicide the area. And I used to be really, really twitchy and scared of herbicide, but people do it. And so one of the sort of parts of this potential high input restoration is the idea of going in, like, instead of taking a plane over or some like giant boom sprayers, going in and doing like spot treatments of herbicide. So yeah, herbicide can help with cheatgrass, and it is a big deal, but we have thus far just tried to avoid that question. Yep.
Like, thinking about the combination of seeding and plugging, like think about like the seed banking.
Mm-hmm.
So is that something that is done? Combination of...
I don't think so. I mean, so something that's kind of related to that is actually the broader context for that study where I did the, comparing the costs, is we're actually trying to establish sagebrush in islands. And the idea is that if sagebrush are being established, then sooner they will be able, like, and we're successfully establishing them, they'll reproduce sooner, and you'll have a seed source on the landscape ready, right? So like a manager, you have to just wonder, is this going to be a good year or not? But a sagebrush is going to put seed out every year. And so you're almost certain to have seed during a really good year and have it waiting there. So yeah, and then and it's part of that island, sort of the island idea of doing these restoration islands. And so that kind of fits into this like high input. You're putting your energy into these islands that, you know, wildlife also like, because they like heterogeneities, and that, yeah, maybe you could at some point, you know, add in other species. And actually for that project, we did do a combination of seeding, because it was an area dominated by smooth brome, which was an intentionally introduced grass, but we wanted to get rid of it to get native. So we had to like plow the whole area under, and then we seeded the whole area, and then so that, you know, it didn't become just a like either smooth brome again or just covered with invasives. And then we went in and did the plugs. So you could, I mean, so it's not too hard to imagine a scenario like that. And you know, and maybe they may be doing that in the Great Basin, I guess, now that I think about it. I mean, and maybe even probably actually, right? Because like seeding is really common. Actually, they probably are. Yeah, I mean, so, you know, they go in, they seed, that's what they have to do. And then people are increasingly going out and planting plugs of sagebrush. And so that would be done after you've seeded the herbaceous layer. You're not just going in and thinking that sagebrush is the only thing that you're going to establish. So yes. Sorry, a long way of getting to my answer of yes. Okay, thank you very much.